Many students work hard on their silver jewelry projects, forging the wires just so, cutting and piercing the sheets to perfection. Everything is exactly correct. Then they inadvertently ruin their projects when they solder the pieces together. What do I mean by this? Way too much solder is used on the solder joints, joins, and seams. This big problem will lead to sloppy looking projects, bad color matches between the silver and the solder, having to use files, emery papers, and repolishing, which will distort and gouge the finished piece. Not to mention dealing with fire scale. In this video, I'll show you how to use a minimum amount of solder that will make your projects look more professional, eliminate the need to file, emery, and repolish, and save you hours of work and frustration. I'm Greg Greenwood. Welcome to my studio. Okay, Greg, you're saying use the minimum amount of solder so I don't ruin my project. How much solder is the minimum amount? Let's look at some examples of solder joints and seams and see if we can answer that question. Here is a solder seam that is 60 millimeters long. How many pallions of solder do you think we need to solder this long seam? How about 1 pallion for every centimeter? Should we use a square cut pallion or bald pallions? Square pallions will fit next to the vertical piece and touch both sheets. Bald pallions will do the same. Does it make any difference? Can we put the pallions in an accessible area for easy cleanup? Maybe along the front of the entire seam. I'll heat the sheets evenly and the pallions will start to melt. Also, I'll heat from the back of the seam so the solder will draw into the seam. Remember, solder will flow toward the heat. The solder has flowed along the entire seam, making a large fillet or snowdrift effect. Let's take a look at the solder seam in more detail. Notice where the pallions were placed is a residue of solder. These are quite rough and will definitely take some effort to smooth them out, especially because there are 6 spots along the seam. Also, look at the large fillet along the seam, making the seam not sharp, crisp, or square. Have we used too much solder? Yes. Now let's solder the same length of seam using a lesser amount of solder. I've cut a 1.5 millimeter square pallion and balled a second pallion of the same size. Do you think this is enough solder for this long 60 millimeter seam? I've placed the pallions at the ends of the seam for easy cleanup. I'll heat the sheets evenly and draw the solder into and along the seam. Notice how I can draw the solder along the seam with the torch. The solder will always flow to the hottest spot. Here is the seam out of the pickle. I lightly brush the silver so you can see the seam and pallion residues easily. The seam is sharp, crisp, and square along the entire length of the seam with a small fillet or snowdrift effect. Where the pallions were placed, there is a residue and will have to be cleaned, but now we only have 2 spots to clean and not 6. Notice the difference in the residues using a square flat pallion compared to a bald pallion. The square pallion was touching a larger surface and needs more cleanup than the bald pallion. What kind and how many pallions do you think you'll need to use for your next solder seam? Using the minimum amount of solder applies to all solder joints, joins, and seams. Soldering wires are not an exception. Let's solder some square wires together. As you can see, if you use too much solder, you are ruining the surface and making more work for yourself. This extra work will definitely lower the quality of your projects. The question is, how much is the minimum amount of solder to use? You have the answer to that question. Start the soldering job by melting a very small amount of solder, smaller than you would normally use. If it doesn't seem to be enough, you can always add another pallion until you have the exact amount. Remember, if you start by using too much solder, you cannot take it back. Simply ask yourself these 5 questions. 1. How large of a solder joint, join, or seam am I soldering? 2. Can I cut my pallions any smaller? 3. Should I use square cut or bald pallions? 4. Can I put the pallions in an accessible area for easy cleanup? And 5. How much extra time do I want to waste cleaning up extra solder residue? I know this seems like a lot of thinking and planning before you solder your project. You've already invested your time and effort to design and fabricate the pieces of silver, so it only makes sense to plan and use the minimum amount of solder. Your projects will look more professional. You will eliminate most of the cleanup time, and you will not be frustrated and will enjoy your soldering experience. One last tip. Don't ruin your finished project by using way too much solder. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss any of the new videos. Check out my website, GregGreenwoodJewelry.com. I'm Greg Greenwood. See you next time.